glad to see so many folks here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Fishman. He is currently a professor of architecture, urban planning, and urban design at the University of Michigan in the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where he is also, at the moment, the interim chair of architecture. Dr. Fishman has written several very important books on the history of urban planning and urbanization. The first, Urban Utopias in the 20th Century, was published in 1977, and it outlines the ideas of Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Ebenezer Howard in terms of their utopian thinking. He also wrote a book entitled Bourgeois Utopias, The Rise and Fall of Suburbia, which was published in 1987, and it is one of the seminal historical overviews of suburbs and the origins of suburbs in the Anglo-American War, in the Anglo-American world. Dr. Fishman received his undergraduate degree from Stanford University, his master's and PhD from Harvard University in history. He's received a number of honors over the last few years. In 2009, this is a particularly good one, he received the Lawrence Gherkins Prize for Lifetime Achievement from the Society for City and Regional Planning History. In 2010, he was the Walker Ames Lecturer at the University of Washington in Seattle. He held the Emil Lorch Professorship at the Taubman College at Michigan from 2006 to 2009. He was a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center in Washington, a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota, and has also held visiting professorships at the University of Paris, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia University. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Fishman to Iowa State University.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carlton, for that generous introduction. As you can see, I've visited a lot of places in my career, and I'm very pleased to have this invitation to Iowa State, and I'm also pleased to see all these people. I guess fans, Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson have a lot of fans, and rightly so. Okay, well, in late 1961, early 1962, two books that you see here were published that transformed their fields and changed the world. And those, of course, were Death and Life of Great American Cities and Silent Spring. And I think one of the interesting things about these two books is although there was a remarkable congruence in terms of time, the two books have largely been discussed separately. They've been part of two very different fields. And tonight, I want to try to put them together. So let's begin with Death and Life. I think it's fair to say, here's the author, Jane Jacobs, in a characteristic pose, raising hell. When the book was published, she was quite famous in the West Village of New York City, and not much beyond. She was an associate editor of Architectural Forum magazine, had not published a great deal. She was known by her opposition to Robert Moses and his plans to run a highway through the great park in Greenwich Village, Washington Square Park. But beyond that, she was quite an obscure person. Her book was an uncompromising attack on the basic principles of city planning, urban design, as they were practiced, as they were held, really, by the most outstanding, the leaders of all of these respective fields. She, as I say, was relatively unknown. Her hubris, her chutzpah, I guess you could say, in challenging the field was met by an attempt to really put her down. Here's perhaps the best known example of Mother Jacobs' Home Remedies by Lewis Mumford, and yet the book actually succeeded and transformed the theory and the practice of urban design. And as a result, she became the remarkable figure that we know today. She moves to Toronto in 1969, where she has yet another career, and dies in 2006. Her counterpart, Rachel Carson, was better known, had better credentials within her field of botany and biology, but she was basically known for a set of essentially very lyrical books celebrating the natural world, such as Edge of the Sea Around Us. She was considered a kind of comforting figure, as it were. So it was especially surprising when her book, Silent Spring, comes out in 1962 after being serialized in the New Yorker magazine, because it too was a slashing attack on the establishment, on the basic practice of pesticides, the use of pesticides, the whole chemical industry, and a whole way of acting towards nature itself. And as serious as were the attacks on Jane Jacobs, the attacks on Rachel Carson were far more polemical. And Rachel Carson responded in her own very effective way. She turned out to be, like Jacobs, a great polemicist and a very able defender of her views. And I think one of the sad things about her life, however, was that when she completed this book in 1962, she was dying of cancer. And in fact was so afraid, she was afraid to even have that known publicly, for fear that the chemical industry would use it against her book, that it was just a kind of personal response to her own tragedy. And she dies in 1964. And I think as a result, the kind of dialogue that might have taken place between these two remarkable books, these two remarkable women, never does take place. And as I say, they're discussed as if they were in two very separate realms. That's what I want to try to deal with tonight, to put them together. And the idea for this lecture came to me when I was preparing two separate classes and was rereading the text. I mean, it might be somewhat disillusioning to all of you to know that professors actually have to prepare and reread the books we assign ourselves. So I was reading them simultaneously, and I suddenly had this revelation. They are the same book. They are the same book. And what I want to do tonight is to try to explain why I think that. In one sense, they couldn't be more distinct. There's almost no overlap in the ostensible subject matter of the two books. Jacobs was a city person. As she said, she was really only interested in big cities. Her idea of nature was Washington Square Park and its environs. She had there was nothing about the natural world in this book. And similarly, if you look at Silent Spring, and by the way, these are some of the remarkable illustrations to the book done by the team of Lewis and Lois Darling. Yes, that really was their names, Lewis and Lois Darling. But if you read the book, essentially for Rachel Carson, the city doesn't exist. Her book is set in this kind of realm of rural America, exurban America. The city doesn't enter into it at all. So there's almost no overlap in the subject matter of the two books. And yet I would assert they are the same book. And I do so on the basis of what I would call the deep argument that both of these books essentially share, stemming from similar and very urgent concerns. And that deep argument I would define as the defense of complex systems, against the terrible oversimplifiers who had the power to destroy them. And for Jacobs, the complex system was the city, what she called close-grained diversity, the incredibly complex interaction of all the different systems that make up the city, and that were under siege by these simplifiers who wanted to create a kind of urban order out of chaos. But as she says, what they saw as chaos was simply a deeper order that they didn't understand. And similarly, for Carson, the complex system was the web of life itself, and the complex interactions that supported it. And I should mention that the photographs that I'm using to illustrate Carson were taken by the great photographer Margaret Burke White, who was commissioned by Life magazine to do a series on Carson's previous book, The Sea Around Us, but which I find as really pertinent to her larger vision. And for her, for Carson, the issue, the real issue of pesticides was the way in which it destroyed, it tore apart this web of life in which all of us are a part. The way in the basic truth that not only the natural world, but we ourselves are part of this natural this web of life. So when we poison the world, we're poisoning ourselves, destroying that complex system that we depend on. This wonderful illustration by the Darlings really, I think, sums up what is at the heart of both of these books: the opposition between the respect for complex systems and the simplicity of the destroyers. And in fact, as both of them realized, the power came precisely from the simplification. You've got too much traffic, build more roads. You got slums, knock them down. You got bugs, zap them. In other words, simple, powerful. Do it again and again, and bigger and stronger. And that will be the way you succeed. But Carson and Jacobs were about respect for the complex systems that make the city a city, that make the web of life sustain us all. That was what they were. That was what they were all about. And there was another thing, perhaps equally important, that they had in common. They were both women. They were both outsiders. They lacked the professional credentials of the people they were opposing. Jacobs, in fact, did not, her terminal degree was high school. She trained herself. Carson had no particular position in the world, in the world of powerful, of big science. And as women, they were outsiders almost by definition. So they had a very difficult task, to say the least. They had to, in effect, raise the level of the discussion. They had to bring to bear a more complex vision of the world than the simplifications of their opponents. But at the same time, they had to somehow, since they were excluded from the professional journals, the summits of power, they had to go over the heads of their opponents and appeal directly to a general public and somehow get them thinking in this more complex terms. And that was really their genius, the genius of writing, the genius of communicating, the genius of actually reaching a large audience and communicating these complex thoughts. Really just a wonderful achievement in terms of that communication. And I fear today, with all our internet and all of that I don't think it could happen today, or at least I fear that we couldn't do it today. There isn't that respect for writing, for the written word, for that strength of communication that was their great strength. So let me go into, I want to go into more detail about what I mean by the defense of complex systems, and in effect, to try to indicate the kind of conversation that, as I say, never happened during the lifetime of these two women, but that I think does develop out of the two books, especially by looking at the thought of two great landscape architects, Ian McHarg and Lawrence Halprin. But first, let me talk a bit more about complex systems and what that means. I think the heart of the intellectual argument that both women were making can be found in the last chapter of Jacobs' book, The Kind of Problem, which she titles The Kind of Problem a City Is. And she develops an idea that she had learned from the biologist Warren Weaver about the basic characteristics of science going back to its great era in the 17th century. And Weaver had essentially said that science begins, or the great age of science begins with what he called the two-variable problem, or relatively simple cause and effect. In other words, one billiard ball hits another, and you can predict exactly where the second one will go. That capacity of the two-variable problem. Then, in the 19th century, science goes on to what he calls the problems of disorganized complexity. And that is where you have, say, 1,000, 10,000 billiard balls, or 10,000 interactions. And as the scientists learned, in a curious way, just because there were so many, you can predict quite accurately the sum total. In other words, the science of statistics, of mastering all of these complex, of all of these different things happening simultaneously, the whole science of statistics and probability. And then Weaver goes on to say that we're now at a third stage, and these are what he calls the problems of organized complexity. The problems of organized complexity, or as we would say today, the problems of ecology. And Weaver defines this as situations in which a half dozen or even a dozen quantities are all varying simultaneously and in subtly interconnected ways. This was organized complexity, in which there was no simple cause and effect relationship. Instead, many complex things were happening simultaneously, and one had to, in effect, respect. You learn this complexity. You learn the outcome by respect for this variation. Now, one way, although neither Jacobs nor Carson used this terminology, one way to describe this kind of system of all the variables is what's called systems theory. And this, of course, was a great movement in the 50s and 60s, exactly when Carson and Jacobs were writing. And Russell Ackoff, one of the great systems theorists of the time, contrasts systems thinking, I guess you could say, systems theory, with with previous science, which he calls analytical theory. And analytical theory is about taking things apart. It's the power to take a complex machine or something, to take it apart, to see how the individual parts work, and by mastering those separate parts, you understand the machine or whatever you're studying as a whole. Whereas systems theory is about taking the system as a whole. And as he says, every system is contained in a larger system. And its role or function in that system, in the larger system, that defines it. And in other words, this capacity to see a complex system as part of a larger system, I think defines the intellectual task of both Carson and Jacobs. Let me try to explain that using this man, Robert Moses, who was Jane Jacobs' great opponent, as it were, though Moses was 1,000 times better known and more powerful. And Moses, to give him credit, was he had a PhD. He was one of the first PhDs in public administration. He understood analytical thinking, and he tried to apply it to the city. And in effect, this confrontation between Moses and Jacobs, was between two different ways of thinking. Now, for Moses, the issue of the modern city is the issue of chaos, of uncontrolled growth, of this complete lack of control, and what planning and urban design had to do was to get control, to impose an order and an efficiency on the city, especially an efficiency of transportation. He was very much influenced by the Futurama concept of these large skyscrapers in the midst of highways. He tries to bring this to New York City itself, the Verrazano Bridge, and essentially to give him credit, something like this is the Cross Bronx Expressway that he pushes through, as you can see, the fabric of New York. This was the result of, for him and his engineers, his highway engineers, of analytical thinking at a very high level. In other words, they analyze, they separate the road from, and its transportation function. Moses once said, cities are created by and for traffic. Think about it. Cities are created by and for traffic. The road must be separated. The road must be separated analytically from the rest of the city so that it can fulfill this function in the most efficient way. They think about things, in other words, the elevated highway, removing cross streets, traffic lights, limited access, and so on. All of these different things to create the most powerful system for moving traffic through the city. And then the object of planning is to somehow push this thing through the fabric, the traditional fabric of the city. This is the Lower Manhattan Expressway that Moses wanted to build, that would have destroyed whole neighborhoods had it been created, and it was Jacob's opposition that really did so much to stop it. But Jacob's opposition was not just political. She understood the street, especially, in a completely different way, in a way that Acuff suggests, as a system that was part of a larger system. And she saw that what Moses perceived as chaos was not chaos, but an order, a higher order, that Moses did not understand. This order she called close-grained diversity. And what she saw was that the street, by being embedded in this complex urban world, every part of it supported each other. For example, the buses got their passengers from people who had come down to the street to shop. The shops got their buyers from people who were waiting for the bus. The business enterprises, in effect, supported the diversity of the street at the same time that people were living there, so it would be a kind of 24-hour street. In other words, all of these different systems, the system of the road was embedded in the larger system of the city. And that was what gave it its meaning and its power. And what Jacob saw that was so shocking, in a sense, was that what to people, to the architects of the time, seemed like progress. This was modernity, the high-rise tower in the park. That this was, in fact, a simplification of what the city really was, and it was that here was real complexity. Here was the essence of urbanism. And again, I think it was the heart of Jacob's contribution to see the street as a system that had to contribute to the larger elements of the system of the city itself. A typical Moses era project, Washington Square South. As you can see, the retail functions were separated from the street, organized, as it were. Part of this statistical mentality that said, a certain number of families need a certain square footage of retail. This is it. This is all we need. Here was, the bad old days with, excess street frontage and so on, congestion. But Jacobs understood so well that that the retail was, again, a system that was part of the larger system of the city, and that the shopkeepers contributed to the essence of the street in so many, not just through selling, but they kept order on the street. They gave it a personality. In other words, that the real life of the street comes alive through this interaction. So far from being obsolete, this was in fact a higher order of complexity that Moses and his followers were trying to destroy out of ignorance because they just didn't understand it. Similarly with mass transit, again, the street had many different functions. It was about sociability. It was a sort of outdoor living room. Her famous idea of eyes on the street for safety. It was a place for children to play. And just a place where the urban drama, what she called the ballet of the city street, could be enacted, played out. The essence of the city was on the sidewalk itself. Right. Okay. Let me go on to Rachel Carson. And as I say, Carson's argument, fundamentally was also an argument of systems, an argument of the defense of complex systems, here against the literal poison that the pesticide industry through DDT was inflicting on the world. Now, Carson, again, respected the analytical virtuosity of the chemists who had formulated DDT and these other insecticides that were so powerful, that had this incredible, broke, in effect, the life, broke into this chain of life. But the problem was, as before, that they didn't understand that the system of the insects they were trying to destroy was part of this larger system, which is the web of life, and that by destroying one part of it, they were destroying that whole web. And I think it's part of her genius that she the term Silent Spring, the title, of course, refers to the loss of songbirds who had been poisoned by, directly or indirectly by DDT. And, this simple metaphor, communicated so strongly. I think this was one of the part of the genius of both of them, that even though they were raising the level of complexity, they found a way to communicate it strongly to the educated reader, how to make people understand this the subtlety that was beyond the leading scientists, or seemingly so. So much of the book is devoted to this careful account of the web of life, how the insects were part of it, the poison that enters through them enters into this whole system of living ecology. The rivers become rivers of death because the salmon depend on the insects, and the insects have all been killed by the DDT. Just so many wonderful and vivid, unforgettable examples of just what this poison was, and always ultimately to remind us that we are part of the web of life. When we poison the rest of nature, we are poisoning ourselves. And as I say, this concept echoes so well in her writing, and I think if there is that it's this point, again, it's very interesting that the vocabulary of life and death, in other words, Jacobs calls her book Death and Life, the whole concept that this is about life and what life depends on, is that, I think that deeper union within the book. So let me go on now to indicate some of the ways, I think, in which this dialogue was in fact taken up in a limited but still, I think, a powerful way. Now, as I mentioned, Jacob's concern was the city. Carson's concern was this countryside. Neither of them had any interest in this, the suburb. And yet, in many ways, the test of both their thought had to do with what do you do about this? How do you deal with this system out of this system? And as I say, I think it was these two great landscape architects, Ian McHarg and Lawrence Halprin, in the 1970s, who really take on and continue the dialogue. Ian McHarg is the author of the great book from 1969, Design with Nature, a book that really, I would say, it's one of the few books where the title really says it all, or close to it. And again, McHarg had this, understood this basic idea of systems theory, that a complex system can only be understood in terms of the larger system. So he is trying to understand the topography and ecology of areas that are under threat of suburbanization, that are about to be suburbanized, and to try to say, what is what is this larger order? How can it be researched? How can it be known? And using this knowledge, how can we plan cities, plan suburbs, plan the siting of suburbs in a way that is congruent with the natural terrain and natural conditions? His main way of learning this was through water and the flow of water, and how the flow of water defined, especially the valleys that were the subject matter of so many of his studies. And again, he was looking for those, that terrain that where development was appropriate, to identify the terrain where development was completely inappropriate, and to use that understanding of the larger system to guide the suburbanization process. And as we see, for this is his study of suburban Baltimore with the very careful design and drawing of water flows and topography, leading to this map that identifies, using this knowledge of the larger system, those relatively concentrated, compact places where development was useful and proper, and those much larger areas where it was not. And this, I think, one of the interesting things, this map should be seen in the context of this one, which showed the typical the typical subdivision pattern that would happen in a place like the outskirts of Baltimore. And as you can see, there was absolutely no relationship between the two. In other words, the logic of suburban development and the logic of design with nature doesn't coincide. And so the threat. And the issue became, that McHarg could never answer himself, was how to discipline this growth, how to really make it follow the principles, the natural principles that he had discovered. And I think that it was his colleague and another great landscape architect, Lawrence Halprin, who took the crucial step here. And Halprin was asked by the then governor of Oregon in 1972, Tom McCall, to make a plan for the Willamette Valley that runs south from Portland, one of the most beautiful valleys, natural areas in the whole country, but one that was very much in danger of being lost to sprawl. And this was the plan. Coming out of this plan were the urban growth boundaries that did so much to limit sprawl in the state of Oregon and for Portland in particular. But Halprin's vision went well beyond it to really, I think, try to reach that understanding of complex systems coming out of Jacobs and Carson. He begins with a very interesting analysis of what sprawl is, of what the forces that lead to sprawl are. And again, as he shows, the essence of sprawl for him was this relationship between the subdivision and the freeway, in the sense that if a subdivision is planned to be isolated, unwalkable, automobile dependent, it requires the freeway. And the freeway in turn spreads and empowers the subdivision. So that is the kind of essence of the process. Then he went on to sketch out the pattern of leapfrog development that he feared would consume the Willamette Valley. And starting from number one, the relatively coherent small town, then there would be some ribbon development, a few subdivisions. Finally, the area between the subdivisions and the roads would be unviable for farming, and it too would be developed in a low-density way. So the result would be this the spread of sprawl that would eventually consume the whole valley, as you see here. So what is the solution to this? Halprin understood very well that the key system was the transportation system. The highway system was spreading this sprawl. It was part of this binary of the freeway and the subdivision. The answer was, and this is kind of surprising to me, at least for 1972, high-speed rail. In other words, to run a high-speed rail line north-south in the Willamette Valley that would in effect become the spine and discipline the growth for the whole valley. And again, 1972 seems so early for high-speed rail. But I do want to remind you, as maybe some of you know this already, where high-speed rail actually comes from. Right. The American Middle West in the 1930s. We invented it. But that's another lecture. So the fundamental idea was you use the rail, to make use of rail, you have to be close to it, close to the stops. So in effect, you use the disciplinary power of the main system and then a kind of light rail system moving out into open territory to concentrate growth along the tracks, what is called transit-oriented development today. And basically, Halprin understood that principle in 1972. You have to be within walking distance of the stops. This concentrates growth. It creates density, community, walkability, all of these things, and it preserves the open space of the valley. And this idea, this powerful, I think, revolutionary idea, was then taken up in the 1980s by Peter Calthorpe especially, and a group of remarkable urban designers, including my colleague at the university now today, Douglas Kelbaugh, who called it first the pedestrian pocket, This is Mount Rainier instead of the Willamette Valley, but it's the same idea, I think, of using rail to discipline growth, to concentrate it where it should be, in effect, a complex system embedded in the larger complex system, a kind of response, I would say, to Jacobs and Carson. So this is the dialogue that I think is so important for us to continue. And I quote this from 1972: "The big changes are still to come. We can still affect them if we act now." In the 1970s, well, we kind of missed that one. But the point is, it's that last one. We cannot change the past, but we can influence the future. And that, I think, is the lesson that that this great dialogue, the really heroic work of Carson and Jacobs brings to us. And I think, one way to define our task, is to continue their work. So I thank you, and I thank them.
So there is, I think, a microphone in the back of the room, hopefully. So if you have questions or comments you'd like to make to Dr. Fishman, he's open to respond. We hope some of you will have questions. So the microphone is going to be in the middle aisle here. So if you have a question, go back. Is it working? Yeah. Go back to the microphone and ask away.
I'm going to go.
What?
Okay,
Okay.
Hey. Yeah. Oh. Hi.
Hi.
Oh, weird. Okay. I guess I'll go first. So you mentioned earlier that Carson was thought of as more sensitive than Jacobs. So why do you think Carson was attacked more for her statements than Jacobs?
Yeah, well, I think that, the chemical industry is just so much more powerful than the planning profession. And I think people, the debate with, or the polemic that she was part of was very revealing and, in a sense, very kind of shocking, because basically the chemical industry had bought supporters throughout American academia, and they called in their chips, and you had some of the most distinguished scientists disgracing themselves, attacking Carson and her credibility. But Carson was a great scientist herself. She was basing her book on literally hundreds of scattered articles that people had done, and so the result of the polemic was to make her even more influential. But billions of dollars were and are at stake in this.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. I just noticed that you pointed out that both of these books by Jacobs and Carson was published in the early 1960s. It was a time when really the civil rights movement was a struggle and going on. So this must have had some type of effect on the human society and the physical environment. So my question to you is, why is it that both of these authors, Jacobs and Carson, ignored the complicated history of race and class?
Yeah, that's a real that's a very important issue, and I think the issue with Carson, as I've shown, Carson's book was, as it were, set in a kind of mythical America, of which I think was important. it was important for the way, for the audience she wanted to reach, who thought of themselves as people in touch with nature. And in this sense, her America is very carefully edited for its purpose. And I think the issue with Jacobs is more difficult and more complicated. That it's absolutely true that she hardly mentions race, and yet in other words, if the only problem with cities was planners and Robert Moses, the cities would have been in great shape. The issue of race and racial divisions was 100 times more serious in my view, and her I think she was part of a liberal philosophy was that the best thing to do about this issue is to try not to see it, to try to pretend that the issue of blacks and whites was like the issue of immigrants 100 years ago. That it was not fundamental, and there is scattered through Death and Life some very interesting observations where she does, in passing, point to this issue of race and racial discrimination. One of the most interesting, I think, is where she testifies to what she believes is the power of the sidewalk, of what she calls a civilized city street, to absorb every kind of difference, including the racial difference. That when people feel safe and are used to an environment with diversity, then black people will take their place as full citizens in the American city. And all I can say is that she drastically underestimated the power, the destructive power of racism. She was not the only one. But that this truly does limit the mean. This was one system that she never truly got into, and I thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
So Jane Jacobs was the one that was discussing New York City, correct?
Yes.
Jacobs Moses. How did she take a stance on the high-speed rail system, and what do you think she would have had to say about the Willamette Valley high-speed rail?
Yeah, I mean, even though she said many times that she had no interest in anything outside of big cities, I think she would have understood its logic. I hope she would have supported it, because she did understand that even a city like New York, any big city, needs a natural hinterland. She understood. She says at one time, and this is again one of her kind of brief observations, that she loves cities and she loves the countryside, and doesn't like anything in between, which is most of America. But I think she would have understood that what Halprin here was trying to do, which was really to both create, if not in other words, the cities of the Willamette Valley would have been small cities or new towns and so on, but they would have been dense, they would have been concentrated, they would have been walkable, they would have saved the rest of the valley from sprawl. So I think she would have understood and favored that. But again, she was cities kind of started to interest her around the time they got to maybe 2 million or more. So she never really comments on that, to my knowledge.
Thank you.
Hi. You stated earlier that Jacobs and Carson's standard of communication through writing cannot be matched by today's leaders and planners because of the influence of the internet today. Couldn't you argue that the internet could expand these leaders and planners' realm of influence because of its accessibility?
Yeah. I think that's I guess what I meant was that when that it was very important for the impact of Silent Spring that it was serialized in the New Yorker magazine. Some of us remember. I mean, the New Yorker is still published, but in the 1960s it was an institution, and what was published there was by definition important. So it got her an immediate, close reading by millions of people. Similarly, Death and Life, though it didn't have that prestigious imprimatur, nevertheless came from a major press, was heavily promoted. It had real weight behind it, and I think the issue, I guess my fear is less about the internet. It's really more that established interests are now, they were taken by surprise by Jacobs, and even more so by Carson. They were unprepared. Today, the chemical industry would know exactly how to deal with Rachel Carson. And, even though she might be in 100 blogs, she would be marginalized. That's at least my fear. That the great thing about that era was, as I say, there was a general public. There was a willingness to read and to read long articles and to really absorb a complex argument. And when a writer came along who could really communicate with that audience, they were willing. Today these books, if they're read at all, they're read as required reading in schools. This was not required reading. People went out and read those hundreds of pages because they felt this is important. This is our lives. And I'm not sure any book can do that anymore.
Thank you.
An excellent topic and a thought I would never have had. So thank you very much. Two things I want to bring together here. There's been a lot of commentary, and some of it quite gleeful actually, about the downfall of the city of Detroit.
The downfall of which?
The city of Detroit.
Yeah.
Manifold problems. Perhaps they will become something again, perhaps not. There is also in our society the local foods movement that says if I don't know who grew my tomato, in what square foot of land they grew it in, it's not worth eating. Aren't these two trends kind of a rebuke of these two women and their arguments?
A rebuke to whom?
Of Carson and Jacobs.
Well, yeah, I see what you mean. To start with Jacobs and Detroit, that I think that that looking at Jacobs from the perspective of Detroit, and not least from the comment of the previous speaker about race, we can see that Jacobs' thought was very powerful, but within a relatively limited range, shall we say, that the kinds of things she hoped for simply could not be achieved in a city that was suffering from massive white flight, that was suffering from massive deindustrialization, from an incredible drain of every kind of resources. Good sidewalks can do a lot, but they can't find. There is a level, a much more serious level. And she didn't understand, or she never suspected that that the American city, even with this talk of death and life, was in the trouble it really was in. Nevertheless, I think you can say that the cities that have come back have come back really on what I would call Jacobean principles. Block by block, street by street, rebuilding that sense of the urban ballet, of close-grained diversity, of mixed use and mixed income. She understood better than anybody else how at least some cities have been able to come back. Now, I would say actually, to turn to the Carson part of your question, that the local food movement really is quite congruent with what she was trying to say, because it's all about rebuilding those networks and rebuilding them outside every single American city, and recreate. I mean, one of the things that's such a deep theme, and is still, I think, a radical theme, perhaps especially in Iowa, is this idea that we don't need pesticides, we don't need chemicals, that that the way to proceed is through respect for the soil, respect for what we grow, and I think that's again a feature of the local foods movement, and maybe its most radical feature that I think comes directly out of Carson and her concerns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. There's